हमारी खास पेशकश में we have a very special guest with us. We have IMF Chief Economist Gita Gopinath with us. Gita, thank you so much for joining us. And as I was telling you, we are live on ET Now and ET Now Swadesh. ET Now Swadesh जो कि हमारा नया हिंदी बिजनेस चैनल है, इसका मकसद है to bridge the gap between the rural India, as we call it, भारत and India. तो सबसे पहले तो आप हमारे ET Now Swadesh के दर्शकों को क्या कहना चाहेंगी?
First, Mayor, hello, and hello to all of you who are watching this. I think it's a very good idea that you have the plan of bridging the knowledge gap between the rural India and urban India. So congratulations on that, and I look forward to watching the channel at some point.
Absolutely. So now we'll straight away jump to the latest World Economic Outlook that IMF has just released. गीता, एक चीज जो हमें देखने को मिली, essentially what you are saying is that growth has a downward risk and inflation has an upward risk. It might be range bound right now, but it exists. So if you have to summarize your World Economic Outlook, what would that be? Should we be cautious?
I would say that the global recovery is continuing, so that's the good news. But the momentum has certainly weakened, and that's been a consequence of the Delta variant and the supply disruptions that has led to. And so all of that has lasted longer than was expected. So we have a small downgrade for the world as a whole. It's a small downgrade. It's just a 0.1 percentage point downgrade. But I think it's important for to keep in mind that the pandemic is not over. These supply disruptions that we've seen with semiconductor chips, and therefore because of that not being able to produce enough cars, we're seeing shortages in stores because of delivery lags and shipping. We're seeing energy prices going up in many parts of the world and then affecting inflation. So all of these pose headwinds for the recovery.
Mm-hmm. In fact, you're right, because, even in India and even globally, we have seen that the supply side disruptions are actually causing a sort of slowdown as far as recovery process is concerned. Do you see that lag effect of supply side disruption continuing well into 2022?
It varies depending upon the sector. So, for instance, if you look at the current steep rise in gas prices, which then has spilled over into oil prices and into coal prices, we expect that effect to subside in the first half of next year, once we get past the winter. Now, if the winter turns out to be much more severe than we expected, then the lasting negative effect of that could be longer. But I think the assumption for now is that by the first half of next year, we would be in a better place. With semiconductor chips, of course, it takes longer for production to come online. It's a slower process, so it goes into more of next year. And again, we're seeing this. Obviously, nobody expected to see this kind of a disruption at this time of the year in energy prices. It's been like a perfect storm of events. So overall, the fact that there is elevated risks in the global economy compared to 2 or 3 months ago is what I would flag. And the fact that policymaking is also becoming much more complicated, because on one hand, you don't have a full recovery in the economy. At the same time, you're having to deal with high inflation. That complicates how you provide support to the economy.
Right. Gita, Fed has also indicated that obviously the inflationary pressures are at play, and at some point they will have to look at tapering. But otherwise, in developed economies and in economies like China, they need to achieve that fine balance between sustaining the recovery or fueling the recovery and controlling higher prices. We have seen what's happening in China due to the energy supply disruption and emission concerns. So, how do you see the central bankers balancing that part?
Central bankers will, clearly have to tailor their policies to their country-specific circumstances. So, since you mentioned China is a country where actually you are not seeing much in terms of inflationary forces. If you especially look at core inflation, it's below the central bank's target. So I don't think that's an issue. In the US, on the other hand, indeed, there are these inflationary pressures. We've seen it strongly in the headline inflation numbers. And because of this continuous increase, for instance, in gas prices and fuel prices, that's feeding in headline inflation. The question is whether that then goes into core inflation. And the expectation is that while, yes, there is a transitory effect, we're not going to expect to see a persistent effect on the inflation numbers, even in the US. So by somewhere the second half of next year, they should come back to much more normal ranges. But this is tricky that, the central banks are not supposed to respond to energy prices going up, but they do respond to a more generalized inflation that shows up in core inflation. As of now, the expectation is that the Fed will only raise interest rates sometime towards the second half of next year at the earliest, or late next year. But that could change, if there is any surprise on the inflation front. And that has consequences not just for the US, but also for the rest of the world.
Right. Gita, keeping this in mind, currently, since you mentioned, and rightly so, that the pandemic is not over as yet, but can we say that the global storm that we saw in terms of economic storm, at least from that point of view, the worst is behind us? There is a firmly placed recovery which is happening. It might be uneven as the outlook mentions, but it's firmly in place, and worst is behind us in terms of global economic outlook and the engines of growth?
But everything about this crisis and the recovery has depended on the dynamics of the pandemic. I unfortunately don't think that we're completely out of the woods over here. But, there are several experts who do believe that the worst may be behind us when it comes to the pandemic. We're getting to much higher levels of vaccination in different parts of the world. There's also the immunity that people have got from being infected from COVID. So that could provide protection. But again, I think countries like India should just completely stay focused on the goal of getting to higher levels of vaccination coverage, which they can certainly do, and also making sure that the parts of the world which have almost no vaccine access, many countries in Africa, unfortunately, are in that situation, that they get the vaccines that they need to get shots in arm.
Mm-hmm. Are you surprised with the pace of vaccination in India? Because it did start slowly and there were issues, supply issues, but lately it has really gathered steam. And it's now, Indians are getting vaccinated actually at a breakneck speed. Are you surprised with that?
I think this is excellent. Indeed, it was slow in the beginning, but it helps India that you have the Serum Institute of India, which has the manufacturing capacity to produce a large number of vaccines, which India is keeping to itself. So, it's being able to vaccinate large numbers of its population. I think it's an excellent outcome that at this point, 50% of the population has gotten at least one dose of the vaccine. And, it continues to go up. So again, I think it's good. The supply is there, but also you need to make sure that there's vaccine hesitancy doesn't become a problem over time, which is becoming a problem in many parts of the world. But that's again another area where you need to make sure that people take the vaccine. But this is a very good trajectory on which India is. Right.
This could have been one of the factors why the growth outlook for India has remained unchanged, at least in the latest report?
Yes, indeed, absolutely. The reason that we have the growth numbers that we do is because of the very healthy pace of vaccination. And we expect that as that continues, it will be able to sustain the recovery and get people back into more even greater normalcy in terms of spending behavior and investment behavior. So indeed, that has been an important factor.
Right. On the other hand, I think the government is also getting its act together. Like the latest example could be, the whole privatization process of Air India. Government was trying to do it for decades and it was not happening. And finally, they pushed it through. There are many other reforms which are in the pipeline or are ongoing as we speak. So what is your take on this whole privatization and the reforms thrust that Indian government is kind of focused on?
The privatization of Air India is highly welcome. It's also been a very long time since the Indian government privatized anything. So the fact that it did this, it's also signals a very strong commitment to their privatization agenda. It's extremely welcome and a very good step. I think it will help with, the plan is to use the money that's raised also for more targeted public infrastructure spending, and that is very beneficial to the economy. I think what we have to keep in mind, though, is that as India recovers, that there is still a distance to travel. If you look at employment numbers, if you look at the output gaps, there is that distance to be traveled yet. You need to be able to bring back consumption growth on a more stronger footing, investment on a stronger footing. That it will take some time, but again, you have to kind of keep your eye on those aspects too of the recovery.
Right. Now, if you look at the next year forecast for India, obviously currently and rightly so, you are looking at maybe the normalization of the pace of growth and hence the 8.5% kind of number that you have indicated for next year. But what is the possibility if things remain as they are and the recovery continues its pace? What are the chances of probably positive upward, revision, or what are the threats in terms of you revising your forecast for India next year?
So the risks, I would say, in the near term, there are some to the downside, which is coal, the shortages on coal front, the fact that oil prices have gone up sharply, the fact that core inflation in India is still very sticky at a high level. So these are downside risks in the near term, in addition to the fact that, like every other country in the world, we have the virus that can come up with a new variant, and that creates problems again. So those would be all downside risks. On the upside, of course, is that if there is no further, if there is a further smooth exit from the pandemic, and you can see that consumer sentiment is getting stronger, business investment is getting stronger, there's demand coming back up, more capacity utilization, which then leads to higher investment. But those would signal then a much stronger recovery, much less scarring than we have currently in our projections.
Right.
But again, if I just add one thing that also requires attention, it remains the case even remains the case is need for investment in the health sector, continued investment in the health sector, and also for education, because we've seen that there's been a big hit to education these last 18 months or so, and that is, has to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Gita, what is your take on China? The kind of, we all know there are some power plants which they had to shut down. There are some factories which are currently offline and off the whole supply grid. And obviously the ongoing tensions that they are constantly sort of triggering. It could be with Taiwan, it could be with India, it could be their overall approach in Southeast Asia. Is it a cause of concern at this point?
In the case of China, we have a very slight downgrade to its growth this year, which has come because fiscal policy tightened somewhat stronger than we expected. In terms of the risks, of course, there is risks that come from the property sector. The property sector is a big part of China's economy, and the government has been regulating that sector, which has then led to some of the events that we have seen. The regulation is necessary, so it's don't get me wrong, it's important to do that. But we've seen the stress that's caused in terms of the impact on Evergrande, which is the largest property developer. So the question, though, from the world's perspective, is that how does this affect China's growth overall? Because when China's growth falls significantly, it has a big impact on the world. Our expectation is that because the government has the tools and it has a policy space, it should be able to ring fence the problem. So there will be some effects on the property sector, which will slow growth. But on the other hand, we don't expect to see it spreading more widely to other sectors in China, and therefore then having substantial negative consequences for the world.
Right. But you mentioned one word, regulation. Do you believe that, they are going little overboard when it comes to regulation? Because everything, suddenly they are so alert about everything that can be regulated. It could be virtual currency, it could be Bitcoin, it could be real estate, it could be even the time kids play on a gaming device. Everything is getting regulated. So do you think they are going slightly ahead of the curve in terms of regulation?
Well, the specifics of what they're regulating clearly matters. I have different opinions about regulating Bitcoin versus something else. I would say that, China, like every other country at this point, has to make sure that you have your antitrust policies working, which is that you're not having these big monopolies being created and the lack of competition. So there's that one piece to it. The second also is to ensure data privacy. I mean, we're seeing companies collect a whole amount of private data, and how it's used is very important. But again, in terms of regulation, the best policy is, first of all, predictability, that you know what the regulations are well in advance so you can comply with them. Transparency is very important. So we do think that it applies to China, it applies to every country in the world, that you need to have those kinds of predictable, stable regulatory policies. It's important to do it. The industry is changing, but that kind of predictability will make sure that this is not very costly to the economy.
Right. Coming back to India, Geeta, and at this point, maybe it matters because what we have seen is Indian markets, the equity markets, are to some extent behaving as if they are decoupled from global concerns or global sentiment, I would say. Secondly, we have actually seen a booming consumption recovery, which maybe 2-3 months back nobody expected, but now it's right here and it's happening. There has been immense inflow into the whole startup ecosystem, and we have seen valuations going through the sky. There was boom in primary markets with the flurry of IPOs that we saw. Somewhere, in terms of valuations, in terms of the way Indian markets are behaving, would you be concerned? And I am asking you as an economist, not necessarily the IMF view.
Well, we're economists at the IMF, so we tend to.
Yeah.
A phenomenon. What we're seeing in India is very similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the world, which is that the equity markets are quite buoyant, and it helps that interest rates are very, very low in all parts of the world, even now. And whatever said and done, large companies have rebounded very quickly from this crisis. So you see that. The problem, of course, is with the MSMEs, where you're seeing bigger problems, right? The medium, small, and micro enterprises, where you are still seeing in India a weakness in their recovery, and that can have effect on the financial sector's balance sheet because of non-performing loans. So I do believe that there is that concern there, because we still haven't exited the pandemic mindset yet, right? So it's not yet, we're not at the point where we are stock taking and looking around the landscape and seeing everything that needs to be fixed. So there is certainly the risk that once we get to that point, which will be good in terms of dealing with the pandemic, you still have to think about the increase in non-performing loans that will quite likely occur, what that implies in terms of capitalization for the banking sector, how do we revive this MSME sector? So I believe those are important challenges for the country.
Right. And if we talk about the bellwether economy, that is US, currently, what is your comfort level about the macro indicators, or I would say the high frequency indicators or data points of US economy? How comfortable are you with that?
If you look at the US economy's recovery, it's already, it was back to the pre-pandemic path in the second quarter of this year. And it's projected to exceed the pre-pandemic projected level where it would have been in the absence of the pandemic, either this end of this year or early next year. So it's on a very strong recovery. The problem is that the risks are elevated. Inflation is a concern, and you've seen that in terms of inflation readings over these last several months. Some of that was perfectly expected because inflation was way too low last year and it's rebounding. So you get some of that back. But the fact that supply disruptions have lasted very long, the problem that, though you've taken out unemployment insurance and extra unemployment insurance, it's still the case that you're not seeing labor come back fully. So these are important issues that still need to be addressed. But overall, our projection for the US this year is 6% growth, and then I think a 5.2% next year. So these are very strong growth numbers.
Absolutely. One last question, Geeta. Two factors which are in favor of India right now, and two factors which could pose a threat to the Indian economy and the slightly longer term India story at this point, in your sense. One
positive is the vaccination scenario, the fact that India has gotten 50% of its whole population to receive at least one shot, and that continues in terms of getting more and more vaccinated. I think that makes India stand out also in terms of developing countries. I think that's a big positive. A second positive, I would say, is there's a mix of things. I just keeping the very near term, I would say the privatization of Air India, for instance, is a positive signal of the commitment of the government to pursue this agenda. I think that's a positive. And more generally, Diwali is a good time for consumer sentiment, and that comes back, the resilience that comes with it. In terms of the risks, I would say the near term, the energy problems could be an important risk in terms of coal and oil prices. The second part of it would be the fact that the recovery is still very uneven, with the problems that I mentioned about medium, small, and micro enterprises still being weak, employment still being below where it should be, with still a big gap there, more people being pushed into poverty. So I think these are, this unequal recovery will also have to be addressed.
Right. You mentioned Diwali. What are your Diwali plans?
I'm looking forward to meeting with friends and having a good meal.
Absolutely. So wish you a very happy Diwali in advance, and thank you so much for joining us, Gita.
Yep. Happy Diwali in advance.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.